Let's do this. One of the aspects of Google Workspace that I really enjoy is how we can consolidate everything into one tool and technology. Hey, I'm Joe Yakuel, founder and CEO of Within. Within is an integrated digital-first agency, and we help brands large and small, from VC-backed startups all the way to large D2C brands, scale across digital media channels, supporting them with both media and creative holistically. Clients hire us at Within to really help them get the most amount of output and get the best ROI on their dollars. Our clients, especially our enterprise global clients, have really strict information security standards, and they make sure that their partners like us are able to meet those standards. And leveraging the Google Workspace allows us to do that in a way that's really effortless. And having Gemini in partnership with our people allows our people to create better outcomes for our clients, which means that the more we use AI, the better our clients do and the higher the ROI in their marketing program. We can shrink down the time of production and maximize that. So something that maybe would have taken 3 months and cost $500,000, we can now do in 3 weeks or even 3 days. There's so many different ways to use AI in the day-to-day work stream, and we really think about using it at every step of the funnel, from coming up with the idea in the first place or even doing the research that generates those ideas, to then the production and the creation or the copy, all the way down to the analysis and the wrap-up. We've also created gems that really allow us to speak in our voice. Our agency thinks about things in a certain way, and we want to be able to answer questions through that unique perspective by training those gems around the way that we think and the information that we have and case studies and white papers that we've derived. When we're looking at a question, we can answer it from the Within lens versus just like a generic marketing lens. The biggest impact that Gemini has had on our business is really when it comes down to really open-ended questions. There's always an 80-20 rule applied there, where when you look back at the amount of time you spent answering that question, 80% of that time was way less valuable than the other 20%, which gave you almost all of the outcome. And Gemini allows us to cut down that 80% to almost zero. One of the cool things about NotebookLM is sometimes we want to do things that are really much more siloed, where we want to take data from that first-party information, whether it's from our agency or from our clients, without getting anything else spilled into it from the outside. And that allows us to get insights that are really rooted in that first-party data. We've always loved Google Workspace, and we've used it for the last 10 years. Leveraging Google Workspace and Gemini allows us to really drive faster insights for our clients.